Let's take a look at the audit of the Federal Reserve Bank through its comprehensive annual financial report. First, in order to provide proof that Ron Paul is telling the truth about the Fed, I found this to be a very telling piece of evidence. This is a clipping from a federal case involving Lewis versus the United States, cited as 680 F2D 1239 from the year 1982, and it refers to federal tort claims involving the Federal Reserve. Here it states that the Court of Appeals held that the Federal Reserve banks are not federal instrumentalities for purposes of the Act, but are independent, privately owned, and locally controlled corporations. As far as determining what is a federal agency, the critical factor is the existence of federal government control over detailed physical performance and the day-to-day operation of an entity. Again, it states Federal Reserve banks are not federal instrumentalities for the purposes of federal torts claims, but are independent, privately owned, and locally controlled corporations. It also states that Federal Reserve banks receive no appropriated funds from Congress, and the banks are empowered to sue and be sued in their own names. Here it states each bank is statutorily empowered to conduct these activities without day-to-day direction from the federal government. So the Federal Reserve is acting completely independent from the federal government. The interest rates on advances to member banks, individual partnerships, and corporations are set by each reserve, and their decisions regarding the purchase and sale of securities are likewise independently made. Now remember, this is the bank, the private international bank, that your federal income tax is going so that it can print our money. It also states in the past the banks have defended against tort claims directly through private counsel, not government attorneys. But we also mustn't forget that the reserve banks, which further the nation's fiscal policy, clearly perform an important governmental function. This is the bank that makes the economy go up and down whenever it wants. I guess that's important. And finally, it states that plaintiffs are not without a forum in which to seek a remedy, for they may bring an appropriate state tort claim directly against the bank. And if successful, their prospects of recovery are bright, since the institutions are both highly solvent and amply insured. Well, I wanted to know how highly solvent these banks really were. And so I pulled up the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report for the Federal Reserve 2008. Now, this is a very long report, and so we're just going to go through a few key pages on the report. Here, in a letter to the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mr. Ben Bernanke, the President of the Federal Reserve, states that pursuant to the requirements of Section 10 of the Federal Reserve Act, I am pleased to submit the 99th Annual Report of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. This report covers operations of the board during calendar year 2008. Now, moving to page 416, under the Statement of Condition of the Federal Reserve Banks by bank, and listed in millions of dollars, as of December 31st, 2009, the accumulative holdings in the Federal Reserve's gold certificate account was $11,037,000,000 worth of gold. Now, do you really want to go to the gold standard? You can see here who has control of gold: government and its corporations. And a little farther down the page, we see that the Federal Reserve has total assets of $2,248,534,000,000. And then just a little farther down, we get to the gold mine. This is what everyone talks about. Under payments to U.S. Treasury, described as interest on Federal Reserve notes, we have the total for all banks at $31,688,000,000 in interest on the dollar on Federal Reserve notes. That is a very significant part of the national debt. This is interest. Interest on the dollar that the U.S. government owes a private institution, a private international corporation, for the use of its paper, something that the U.S. government could do itself without interest of any kind. This is the very definition of usury. Absolutely unnecessary and corrupt. And at the bottom it shows that the Federal Reserve has a surplus as of December 31st of $21,075 million, which is up from the beginning of the year by about $2.5 billion. That's a heck of a profit. On page 445, it has the number and annual salaries of officers and employees of the Federal Reserve Banks. And in the totals section for just the New York Federal Reserve Bank, these boys are getting paid $293,025,032, with the total annual salaries of officers and employees of the Federal Reserve Banks at $1,383,973,408. Funny, that's about what David Walker said that the deficit of the federal government is.
We had a $1.4 trillion deficit last year. We expect to have about a $1.4 billion deficit this year.
I think we just found a cure for our wounded federal government. Now, as we know, Timothy Geithner quit the Federal Reserve Bank to take an appointment by President Obama as the Treasury Secretary. Here is his severance pay. It states that in January 2009, the Board of Governors, at the request of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's Board of Directors, approved a special separation payment of $434,686 to Bank President Timothy Geithner. And on January 1 of each year, all presidents receive salary increases equal to the percentage increase in the midpoint of their respective salary ranges. Wow. And once again, we see that Deloitte and Touche is the independent auditor chosen by the Board of Governors for the Federal Reserve. And here it states the financial statements of the Board of Governors for 2008 and 2007 were audited, an audit of the Federal Reserve by Deloitte and Touche, independent auditors. And finally, we get to page 486, where it refers to the Government Accountability Office reviews. Where have we heard that office before? David Walker, the Auditor General of the United States, of course. You see, it turns out that under the Federal Banking Agency Audit Act, Public Law 95-320, most Federal Reserve System operations are under the purview of the Government Accountability Office, or GAO. The reports are available directly from the GAO. So there you go, Ron Paul. Why don't you just go to the Comptroller General of the United States and just grab the reports from him? There's your audit of the Federal Reserve. Now get on it, man. So if you really want an audit of the Federal Reserve, here's the man to talk to. He knew what was going on the whole time he was in office, because the Federal Reserve and other branches of the federal government have to go through this man and get those audits approved by the Government Accounting Office that he represented. All the secrets of the Federal Reserve are within this man's corrupt head. Now, in the interest of time, this brings me to the end of my presentation. So what is the solution here? Well, corporations are people too, but they're not real people. They are fictional persons. They are straw men. They are not real. And corporations can be dissolved. They are not your government, though they like to think they are. A republic government is a group of representative officials, and you do not have that. And you do not have a constitution to protect you. Now, on that note, The comprehensive annual financial reports that I've been referencing were from 2009, most of them ending June 30. But the stock market has gone up by almost 3,000 points since then, which would represent about a 40% increase at least in the value of the stocks held in these funds and government accounts. The 2010 Comprehensive Annual Financial Reports are due out at any time, and I would invite you to examine them yourselves and to see the astronomical gains that government has probably gained in the last year. What we've talked about here is corporate fascism, admitted in the financial reports of the federal and local, state, county, and other corporate governance across the United States. We have a problem. We cannot change this corrupt system of corporate fascism from within the current corporate structure of government. Washington, D.C. is its own country. It is a foreign corporation that is not part of the 50 states united. This is the best kept secret of our time. We cannot trust in the two-party system of government. This is not a question of voting them out, perpetually changing between the two dominant political parties. The definition of insane is indeed to repeat the same action over and over, electing the same media-driven candidates, the media being owned by government, and insanely expecting different results. This is a different kind of lesson that we all must learn, perhaps the hardest medicine of our lives. For we, the people of the United States of America, are no longer governed by the Constitution for the United States of America, nor are our politicians bound in any way by its republic form of governance. In fact, some corporate cities and townships are now passing laws which blatantly state that their elected and appointed officials are not bound by any oath that they take. Tremont, Utah, near me, to name just one. If you are part of an activist group such as We Are Change, End the Fed, the Tea Party, or any other group out there, you must understand that this is truly the only issue that is viable in the fight to take our country back. This is the holy grail of information. This must be comprehended in order to understand why things like 9/11, the Federal Reserve's powers, and political parties and lobbies have a tyrannical grasp on all of us.